This is Unsupervised Learning, Redpoint's AI podcast, and I'm Jacob Efron, one of your co-hosts. Today I'm joined by guest host Rob Toews from AI firm Radical Ventures, and we had a fantastic guest today, Peter Welinder, the VP of Product and Partnerships at OpenAI. Peter is responsible for the OpenAI products you know and love, GPT-4, ChatGPT, Github Copilot, and we had a fascinating conversation. Talked about everything from how OpenAI thinks about what they will and won't build with regard to agents, developer tools.
That's sort of a top-down decision that we made at OpenAI, that this is our bet, and we're not going to spread across too many other bets.
We talked about when Peter thinks we'll reach AGI.
It's like something is very different now than how it felt 15, 20 years ago. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we have something that resembles AGI by the end of this decade.
And we hit the future of open source models and when they will and won't be good enough. Definitely tune in for this one. Peter, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here.
I want to start with a big picture question that a lot of folks on the investment side, on the startup side, kind of throughout the AI ecosystem are grappling with and thinking about and talking about these days, which is this question of where value will ultimately accrue the most in the AI ecosystem. And you can, there are a lot of different ways to divvy up a mental model of the AI ecosystem, but I think, people often think in terms of the model layer, the infrastructure layer, and the application layer, and where the most interesting opportunities arise. I'm curious to hear how you think about that topic and what your mental model is, given where you sit at OpenAI. Obviously, OpenAI is at the very front of the field in terms of building world-leading models that are powering a lot of this transformation. But at the same time, OpenAI also obviously makes possible all sorts of end user applications across different sectors and industries. And you guys have an investing arm that's investing in a lot of different application layer companies. So I'm curious how you think about things when you hear the question around where will value ultimately accrue in the world of AI?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the simple answer I think is that it's going to be in a lot of those areas where most of it will accrue. I think I suspect that most of it will accrue kind of at the application layer across a lot of different applications. And in fact, like very much the strategy or the approach we have at OpenAI is that, our mission is essentially build AGI, make sure it's safe, make sure it benefits all of humanity. And I think central to that is really enabling as many builders as possible to build products on top of this technology. So we've made a conscious choice to make sure that we don't have a lot of value extraction at the model infrastructure layer, really trying to kind of keep prices really low to enable way more development. And you can actually see this as we made some pretty dramatic price cuts over the years. I think we made one about a year ago that we cut prices by 70%, and we released a model that was 10x cheaper, GPT 3.5 turbo than the original 3.5 model. It was also much faster. Ton of both the research and the engineering that we do is to kind of, bring down prices, because it just broadens the access to these models and the applicability of these models to many more applications. And I think that's a super critical component, and tooling is obviously a super important component. I think we spend less of that time on that. There's just so many, the right tools for this technology just haven't been invented yet. Some of them are probably in the early stages, and we have no illusion that we will be the ones that kind of come up with those. I would much rather have the developer ecosystem figure out what are the best tools and actually build those. Because when we release a lot of these models, we put in a lot of effort, obviously, to kind of make sure that they're safe, responsibly deployed. But also in the way to kind of apply these models, what you can apply these models to, we don't know that beforehand. We're figuring this out together with the community as we go in some sense. And it's much better to have we have about 400 people at OpenAI. There's going to be millions of people that are already building on top of this technology, right? And they are the ones that are going to come up with all those interesting ways, those interesting applications, those interesting tools that you can kind of use to kind of be even more productive. Obviously, if you have a factor of over 1,000, 10,000, there's just going to be way more innovation in that space. And so we really want to enable that. I do think at the end of the day, what you see, where you will see like a lot of the value capture is probably going to be at the application layer, where the companies are able to kind of build really kind of great applications with some of the standard things you have in any business, like, the standard kind of competitive modes around network effects, around branding and so on. That's like really where you often have the opportunity to kind of do a lot of that value extraction. I don't think it would be very much different here. It's just kind of another technology where a lot of the same principles apply. And in fact, we will be very happy with that in some way. It's like, there's this like Bill Gates quote, like, you have a platform where the value generated on the platform is much bigger than the value that's actually captured by the platform provider. I think that is kind of the aspiration here, is that we get to that point where there's just a tremendous value being generated on top of this technology.
That makes a ton of sense. As one quick follow-up to that, could you envision, or do you envision OpenAI starting to build more and more like first-party applications for folks, or staying more at that platform level?
We really want to stay at the platform level, at the more general level. Like, this is like, obviously we have ChatGPT, which is kind of a product that's more focused to consumers. But even that application, it's a very general application. It's sort of like, it is there to really answer more generic questions. It's not meant to be like the best AI teacher in the world, or the best, AI doctor or lawyer or whatever. Like, there are companies who are really building on taking those applications one step further. And that will involve not only kind of the intelligence part or the reasoning part that we can provide with our models, but it also provides like integrations to other products, to like connecting it with kind of proprietary kind of content, like training it specifically with the expertise of people in those domains and so on. And so the way we really look at this is like, we want to provide a platform for companies to kind of build those experiences, and probably also kind of connect it to ChatGPT. Like, the first step in this direction is like plugins in ChatGPT, where you can actually connect ChatGPT to other kind of external services and so on. And I think that's a direction where we go into even more. So in some way, we really want to be a platform layer at different layers, both for the kind of the raw reasoning, but as well as the kind of providing companies with kind of access to actually reach consumers with their products.
Yeah, no, I mean, you mentioned kind of plugins with ChatGPT, and we'd be remiss not to mention, I mean, the pace at which you and the team are shipping product right now just feels insane, right? I mean, plugins, web browsing, mobile, it's I imagine, it probably only scratches the surface too of all the potential ideas that get thrown around internally. There's so many different directions you can take a product like ChatGPT. How have you kind of been prioritizing what to build, and like, how do you kind of see this product and kind of the plugin ecosystem you've built evolving?
I think a lot of like the way we approach these things are first kind of trying to have a fairly high focus on kind of the models themselves. Like, this is where a lot of our efforts go in. Like, I think OpenAI took this approach, which is a bit different from other research labs, where we just made a really big bet on language models and just how general they would be. And, this is a bet at many different levels, everything from like ensuring that most of the people within OpenAI were focused on large language models. Most of the compute we had, most of the GPUs were being spent on training these models. And that's sort of like kind of a more of a top-down decision that we made at OpenAI, that this is our bet, and we're not going to spread across too many other bets. We have a few other things in kind of parallel that we think at some point we'd kind of tie into the broader picture. But we used to have more bets. Like, we used to have robotics bets. We used to have kind of bets on, say, beating world champions in Dota 2. These were all to kind of really push technology directions really, really far for us to learn, to see how viable they were. But as we kind of gain more confidence in one direction, we put most of our efforts into that. And I think this is sort of continued in that the reason that we can kind of move fast with a lot of these things like browsing and our and plugins and so on is like we're building on top of these language models, like, and they are incredibly flexible. And at that point, if you have that like kind of platform layer of just the really flexible language models, then the only other thing you need is really smart people and like driven people. And we've been very lucky to kind of just have some incredible both researchers, engineers, and product people at OpenAI who can like just have these ideas and can take them and kind of take them from the research stage all the way to product. Where I think a lot of kind of a big difference from also other kind of more research-oriented organizations or organizations that have research labs is that I think a lot of the people who are more research-focused at OpenAI are also very motivated to actually get their stuff out in the hands of users and learn from that. And I think that's how we can see a lot of these products like, or these features like browsing and plugins and so on. It really came through researchers having a vision of like how you can build on top of these language models and then put them out in the product. And then we try to build a product that has the flexibility where it's easy to kind of deploy that. Plugins and was kind of a way to kind of unify a bunch of different things we were doing around browsing, around code interpreter, and like connecting to external APIs. We just try to look for these kind of common patterns that will enable the research teams to get their stuff out faster into the hands of users.
Yeah. I mean, one interesting area I'd be curious for your thoughts is it does feel like, over the last months, autonomous agents have become all the rage, right? And this like big next step change in like capabilities of large language models. I'm sure you guys have been thinking about that and wondering how you see that, potentially being part of the product here.
I mean, in some way, we already have it with plugins. It's just like a little mini agent that at this point, kind of you give it a task and it just connects to a number of APIs in a certain sequence to kind of carry out some task. If you want to kind of, create some recipe on a topic, right, and then you want to kind of put that on a shopping list on Instacart and so on, you can use our plugins to kind of do those things. And so it's fairly straightforward to kind of play that out towards like, well, you wanted to kind of do more complicated tasks, only check in with you when it gets the kind of model gets a bit uncertain on what it's supposed to do. And then suddenly you have a much more agent-like kind of behavior. I think, but this is also like where I think that it is really great to have this, the API aspect of our product, which enables developers to really push this much further and like explore much faster than we can. So I just think it's like incredibly inspiring to look at these things like, RGPT, Baby AGI, these kind of projects and see how like what people are doing with them. I would say like my current sense is like just with plugins, it's sort of still early. Like these things aren't working perfectly. They're a bit rough around the edges. But you can see the potential in them. Like they just need to be a little bit more robust, a little bit smarter. And we all know that this is like going to be happening over the next kind of year or two, that like we're going to have another generation of models that are going to be way smarter. And then a lot of these things will start to work. So I think what we're really optimizing for here is like, we try to really think about it. We're an AGI company. We try to look at a lot of what we're doing from the lens of like, what will this product look like when we have AGI? What does it mean? Like when you have an AI, you can actually ask it just as you would like ask a human to do something. The human would go off and do things and come back and check with you. Like it's like you hire a new employee to do like, to say, you hire an employee to code your iOS app and you give them some vague directions. They come back with questions and they go off coding. Then they show you something, you give feedback on that. It's sort of like, if we're building AGI, that's sort of probably what we're going to have in a couple of years, right? And so I think you should kind of expect the product to evolve in that direction.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I share your excitement around the concept of agents, and it does feel like a natural step on the path toward more generalized intelligence. One topic I'm very curious, Peter, to hear your thoughts on is around open source AI and open models. There's obviously been a massive explosion of activity in this space just over the past few months, in particular after Meta's release of Llama and all the kind of progeny of Llama that have emerged. I'm curious to hear how you think about how open source models fits into the broader AI and LLM ecosystem, in particular with the perspective that, at least at this point, OpenAI's most advanced models are closed source and OpenAI's business model is based on that. I'm curious how you envision the kind of closed versus open AI ecosystem playing out.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, and maybe this is where I think I might have like a more kind of unpopular opinion, honestly, in the sense that I think there is a lot of there's a kind of growing belief that at some point like these open source models will essentially catch up with the models that OpenAI and others have, and so that's kind of where this would go. I think this is true in the very long run. Because I think we should expect just like everybody, the sort of the compute we have in our phones and our devices to just keep on getting better. I mean, we have Moore's law, but there's other things here that will happen that will probably accelerate that over time. But I think that's going to play out on a slightly longer time horizon. But in the kind of, I would suspect that at least. I think there's always going to be a category of models or like maybe more accurately like AI systems that will be way, way better than the open source kind of versions of those same models. Like we've sort of seen that play out in a lot of other areas. Like, desktop Linux has been a thing for 30 years and it's never really kind of caught up to Mac OS X and iOS and Windows and so on. Like, because there's never enough kind of investment into a lot of the details and so on to kind of get it all the way there. And so there's going to be something similar here. That said, I think the other trend here is that the amount of capital and just like amount of engineering that goes into both training these models, but that also essentially doing inference in these models, like running them at scale and so on. It's very non-trivial, and it's just hard to replicate at an open source level, and so the incentives are definitely going to be like the companies that are investing a lot of this. They're not going to want to kind of open source it. I think that's just that doesn't make sense from an investment standpoint. It's also questionable from a kind of a safety standpoint. I think what is important is that that there's broad access to these models. And that's very much what we're focusing on at OpenAI. But I'm not sure that, I'm more skeptical that this would happen through open source. That said, that doesn't mean that I don't want to kind of be sort of all poo-poo on open source. I'm actually very excited about the open source development. Like, I think there's a ton of energy in that space. And there's both in terms of seeing just I think having open source models is extremely useful for pushing the research forward, for having people just try out new approaches, different kinds of ways of training these models, for applying them in different ways. There are also going to be product areas where it makes sense to have kind of an open source model that can be, or rather kind of, I think it's more like having kind of maybe the way of putting it, kind of smaller models, like if you want to put them on a device or on the edge or kind of in different kind of on-prem deployments and so on. You kind of have to use kind of more an open source kind of approach, and I think it has a role there. But if for the applications where you really want the best stuff, where you don't need to want to worry about the reliability of the model, like how smart it's going to be, you just want the smartest, the thing that's actually going to work the best, then I think the most rational thing is going to be to pick one of the kind of the proprietary models, and those will just keep on getting better and probably be a couple of years ahead of open source for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. I think it's a very fair perspective that there will be this persistent performance gap potentially between the best cutting edge closed source models from places like OpenAI as opposed to what you can get from open source, and that the frontier is constantly moving, and it's likely to be the kind of the proprietary research, AI research organizations that are advancing that frontier.
Actually, like I have a comment on that. Actually, one more comment on that, which I think is important, is that I think one interesting thing is that there is an open question about like how smart does the model need to be for certain tasks. Like if you're doing something like just summarizing something, then you may not need the smartest model. But then the problem that we often see kind of customers facing who are working with these open source models is that products tend to go towards generality over time. And then you just want the models to be generally smart. And then, so if you have a very specialized thing, then it makes sense to kind of have an open source model. You fine tune it specifically for that purpose. But then that just means that you will have a very narrow product. And if you try to go just slightly outside of the domain of that, you're going to hit an issue. And that's like really where like the generality of these models come in. And so, for example, even for like a customer service bot, like if you wanted to kind of just be able to kind of deal with all the edge cases and so on, right? You need the smartest model. But there is a question about like how every time you kind of make a smarter model, it's going to be able to cover a few more use cases. And so I do think there's going to be continue to be applications where probably an open source model is going to be sufficient for that application. So there is that dimension to it as well.
Yeah. And this question relates to that point, and to how much generality you actually need for a given commercial product. But OpenAI obviously is many things as an organization. You're a business. You're also a research organization pursuing AGI. I'm curious, even granted that open source may not be able to keep up with closed source in terms of performance, like, do you think that this movement of open source models could present or does represent a meaningful competitive risk to OpenAI from a business perspective and from like an addressable market perspective?
I don't think so. And the reason is that I think that most of the value is ultimately going to be in the smartest models. Like it's sort of like, like give you an example of like, are you when you hire people, you always try to hire the best people, right? I think it's going to be the same thing as you're building these sort of products. You'll want the smartest models because those are the ones which are going to give you the best products. And we will see the same thing play out here. It's just like if you're picking a model that's a bit dumber, you're going to be at a competitive disadvantage with the companies that are picking a smarter model. And so our bet has sort of been that that's where like most of the value over time will just accrue is in the smart models. That's where you can tackle the most economically valuable problems and so on. And I think like what we will essentially see is like first we will see kind of this working for more and more kind of, I guess, professions, like where you can start building, say, co-pilots for different professions like lawyers and medical providers and so on. And over time, it would sort of probably go even beyond that. It's sort of like, well, if you then want kind of AI scientists that come up with new drugs or come up with, solutions to climate change and so on, that's a whole new level of like economical output you can get. And we would just kind of see that kind of moving higher and higher over time. So that is going to continues to be the way we think about it. And so our effort is always going to be put mostly on that. There's some auxiliary stuff that are useful with smaller models. Like give you an example, using smaller models for embeddings, for retrieval, for grounding these models it's useful to have a kind of a smaller model for that, and those can actually be open source. And there's some advantage with having those open source. And it's it is because in that case, like latency and so on is much more important often. And so you like having a smaller kind of model is important for that. Also, kind of making sure that you have a little bit more control over like owning, like recomputing embeddings can be expensive. So probably you want an open source model. So I can see us kind of, we already do this. Like we look at a lot of like, what are sort of models that can kind of enable more kind of smarter model use in some sense. And, our Whisper models is an example of that, where we open source the model because it actually allows people to now do very accurate transcription of audio and now they can feed that into large language models and get build many more applications that it couldn't do before because the speech recognition stuff wasn't accurate enough. And so that's a really where we just want to enable that as broadly as possible. We don't think we will make any meaningful amount of money on speech kind of recognition, but we want to enable more use cases, and I think that's often how we pick where we make our open source investments.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And obviously companies will try to optimize, costs and latency, but I totally hear you on the idea that even if there's orchestration to route some tasks to distilled models and some tasks to the cutting edge ones, the real economic value accrues to, the state of the art models, right? I mean, those are the most sophisticated tasks that will be routed their ways. So I think it makes a ton of sense. And I mean, you mentioned some of these enterprise, use cases. And obviously I think one of the most exciting things about being in the space is it just feels like every day there's, new announcements and new ways companies are working with these models. I feel like you're on the ground seeing this and working with these folks. And I'd just be curious, obviously I feel like we've gotten some level of enterprise adoption. I'm sure there's, still 99.9% of it to go. So as you think about kind of some of the gaps today that you're seeing that are preventing folks from really going as full steam as you'd like with some of these models, what are you seeing on the ground?
I think probably the biggest gap right now is the problem of hallucinations. These models hallucinating facts. So you can't entirely trust them. And we hear this over and over again. And and the truth around this is it's sort of one of these things where we're enough on the cutting edge in this field generally, where this is an open research problem. How do you solve this problem of models not hallucinating? We put in a ton of effort into our models to make them more and more robust to this. And I think the way that more and more companies are getting around this is basically grounding the models in kind of external data. So, for example, if you're asking a question and you have some internal company documentation where you want to, which you can use to answer that question, you can use these kind of embeddings to approaches to where you embed the question, you embed all your documents, you have a vector search database where you find the relevant documents, you give those to the language models, and then the language models essentially picks the relevant information from those documents to summarize an answer to the question. And then you can kind of get around these problems of the model hallucinating. You actually tell the model, if you can't find the answer, just say, I don't know. So it's kind of funny. You just kind of instruct it to do that. And it works really, really well. And but I think this has been kind of probably as I've been looking at applications, that the hallucination issue has probably been the number one issue.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, back to the earlier conversation we're having about what you guys build and what you don't, and kind of some of these developer tools emerging. I mean, obviously there's a ton of developer tools that have emerged around getting around this. There's hacky ways I've seen different enterprises get around this. Is this something that you kind of wait for, the larger ecosystem to build tooling around, or is it something that OpenAI just eventually solves themselves? How do you think about that?
I think it would be it's going to be something that where the way we can make decisions on that is we're going to be listening to our developers to sort of where are your obstacles? What is preventing you from being successful, and what can we do to enable you to kind of move faster? That's one aspect. So then, if there's certain pieces of tooling that are all of our developers need, then we will probably build some of that tooling, at least to some extent, so that at least it's easy to kind of get off the ground and kind of get going, developing quickly. I think the other thing that we're thinking about is sort of what are the areas where we are, we are really kind of the best in the world at doing things. And I think it's training these models, making sure inference is really, really good. And so that's where we got to put most of our efforts, because that's where we can provide the most value in some sense. So we would always prioritize that higher. It's just if I look at all the things that people are asking us for, probably lower prices, higher reliability, lower latency, we're always going to be prioritizing that first. And then, because there's plenty of other companies that are building really good tooling on top of that. But unless you have those fundamentals, that key kind of intelligence product, that tooling doesn't matter. Yeah.
Peter, another topic I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on. And there's been more and more discourse around this topic in recent weeks and months. There's obviously AI is a technology with tremendous upside potential. We all believe deeply that it has the capability to improve humanity and civilization, but it's not without its risks and downsides as well. And there are a number of different downsides and concerns around AI that people have been spending time thinking about, from misinformation and deep fakes to bias in AI. Job displacement is obviously a big topic, and then even the bigger picture, could a runaway powerful AI pose an existential risk to humanity itself? I'm curious, from your perspective, which risk or concern around AI do you think is the most important one, and the one that we collectively should be taking the most seriously and thinking the most about?
Yeah, I would say, like, my take on this is, like, if I look at, like, the first few risks that you listed, I think those are all pretty surmountable. I think and a lot of them aren't. A number of them are to do with the models, but they're also on distribution channels, like, misinformation and so on. Like, you can't really do misinformation becomes a problem when you do it at scale. And so you need to kind of go via some of the existing kind of platforms and so on to do that, whether that's like, social media or kind of email or something like that. So there's already there's already a lot of, like, infrastructure in place to protect against that. I think similarly with bias, a lot of our take on this is that it's impossible to not have bias in your models. And what we want to do is, like, really provide the tools so that you as a product developer can, or as a user, can kind of instruct the models to have the biases that you want, obviously within some bounds. But we want those to be very broad, like they shouldn't have a particular political orientation and so on. Like, it should really be up to the users to pick the behavior of the model that they want. I think the risk that we, like, paying too little attention to is probably the one around, like, right now we're going towards AGI, but I think the next step is going to be superintelligence. Like, these models are going to get really, really smart, and beyond the smartness of humans. We don't know what timeline, but it's like, that's a pretty big deal, So it just feels like, and there's just a surprisingly little amount of research being done on, like, how do we ensure that outcome is good. Like, we have teams at OpenAI who are doing it, but it's sort of, there's no, like, super intelligence safety department at universities and stuff like that. It's sort of, and if this, I do think that this can both be, this can sort of be existential for humanity. And so I think it's really important that we think about it both in terms of the techniques, the technical aspects of how do we ensure that these models are aligned, that we as humans are able to control them, but also that there are also kind of other areas around regulation to ensure that that the government understands and at a worldwide scale understands when we're getting into when we're getting close to this, like which companies are doing it, like how much compute are they using to train the models that would be able to kind of go beyond AGI in some sense. And I think it's one of those things where it's sort of like, we've talked about it a lot at OpenAI, and it hasn't been taken very, very seriously. And I think superintelligence is still one of the things that isn't taken very, very seriously, but I think it will be a very serious topic within the next decade. So, and I think the sooner we can have a much more kind of serious debates and so on around that, the better.
Yeah. Two quick follow-ups for me on that. I think it's a fascinating topic. The first, I know that you don't know and nobody knows, but everyone still loves a good prediction. So I'm curious, like, what's your best guess as to the year that we are most likely to reach superintelligence? And again, I know this is just speculation. I know you don't really know for sure, but I'm curious what you would say.
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, I think I had sort of, we sort of have a definition at OpenAI around AGI, which is like autonomous systems, AI systems that can do economically valuable work at the level of humans. And I think we have a shot at doing that, before 2030. The exact probability, I think there's definitely some probability that there's something unknown that we don't know about that will prevent us from getting there. There can also be like external kind of events in the world that happens, maybe where it gets huge like GPU chip shortage or something like that would prevent us from going there. But things seem to be moving in a kind of almost like automatic fashion at this point. There's just so much innovation in the field that it feels like we're really on a trajectory. I would say like, this is speculative, right? I don't know, I definitely don't know for sure, but it does feel like something is very different. I've been in this field for like 15 years. This is not what it felt like, 15 years ago. It was like, I have no idea like how we could even get there. Now it feels like it's sort of on the path of kind of just happening. And, I'm not the only one saying this. Like privately, as I talk to many people who have been in the field for much longer than me, they say the same thing. It's like something is very different now than how it felt like 15, 20 years ago. And so that makes me feel like I think I wouldn't be surprised if we have kind of something that resembles AGI by the end of this decade. And then like super intelligence is so interesting in how you define that. It's like, well, can you run this AGI much faster than humans can think in a much more parallelized fashion and so on? Like different dimensions you can think about super intelligence. You can do many more experiments than a human could do and so on. I mean, some of those aspects will probably be possible. There's also some chance that we get there and it's like, we have AGI, but it's like too expensive to run and we need to wait another 5 to 10 years before we can actually run it economically. That's a potential outcome. But I think like 2030 is probably around the time where I imagine that we will start really seeing kind of the early signs of superintelligence. That's my speculative bet, and we're probably, there's some chance I will need to eat that up in 10 years.
I mean, you're totally right. It's incredible how just what it feels like in this space today, how quickly things are moving. It's impossible to keep up with. It's exhilarating and also overwhelming. One more question for me on this topic. Jeff Hinton recently made waves and got a lot of headlines when he publicly said that he's worried about the potential kind of existential negative consequences of super powerful AI. And so to your point, and others, Yoshua Bengio and others have voiced similar concerns. To your point around the unpredictability of what AGI and then especially superintelligence will look like, how worried are you about like an extreme downside scenario where like the continued survival of humanity is at risk? And if that is a risk that you take, that you see as credible at all, like what role do you think OpenAI as the leader in the field should or is playing there?
Yeah, I definitely, I think I'm probably a little bit more on the optimistic side, that I think that we will be able to kind of figure this out as humanity together, because a little bit like we haven't had a nuclear war, because we have some level of self-preservation. I think there will be something similar here, where I think as we get closer to AGI and superintelligence, we will tread much more carefully, and in fact, but I think that the way to do this is you kind of need to build up the right organizational processes, the right kind of frameworks to think about this and so on. This is very much has been the strategy from OpenAI for the past couple of years, is that we think it's really important to get these models out when the stakes are low. So we learn from all the kind of the risks that are kind of arising when those stakes are low, like things like misinformation, things like biases and so on. Like kind of how do we tackle these? Because if we can't tackle those, then I feel like not very confident that when we get to like superintelligence, we will know what to do. And again, like it's not only about the technical approaches. It's even like how do we have like the right kind of organizational structures for making decisions around when to deploy things into the world and when not. What are the safeguards and so on. This is not stuff that you can just kind of figure out once you get there. If you train them on, now we have superintelligence. Now let's figure out how to make it safe. That seems like really, really off to me. And so our approach has really been like, let's like gradually figure this out. And if we feel like the things are kind of getting a bit kind of too unsafe, then we will hold back on releasing it. We did hold back on releasing GPT-4 for almost half a year just because we wanted to kind of get much more clarity in kind of the potential downsides of this new model. And I think this is how I think if we set that example at OpenAI, I think others will also, that it's easier to set that examples if you're sort of one of the leaders in the field, because then that adds some accountability to others as well. And we hope through some of our actions that we can kind of add that accountability elsewhere. And I think at the end of the day, then the chances of this being a really positive outcome, which I think it can have, right? Like let's also talk about the upsides, right? Like if we actually get super intelligence where it can solve all the problems we're facing today, like climate change, like cancer, things around aging, all the things that happen as you age, it's like kind of more abundance of and higher standard of living for everyone. Like this is the upside of this technology, right? And so I think it's like it is important that we get it out. We just need to do it carefully.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I was struck by that you said earlier is obviously you guys are doing a lot of work on this at OpenAI, but there isn't, you mentioned these kind of lack of like super intelligence safety departments at universities, right? And folks thinking about it. And, I do wonder, like, if you were, if you were in a different life running, a super intelligence safety department at a university with a large budget, like, what would you kind of focus on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a few different areas. Like I think there's a lot of work that can be done on like understanding what's going on in these models. They're still fairly black box. So interpretability, there is a number of like people who are doing this, like and there are people like Chris Olah, who used to be at OpenAI, who's now at Anthropic, has done incredible work on that. There's a number of others who like where you kind of go deep into understanding kind of why are certain activations within these deep neural networks happening, and like how can you use those to understand what's going on into the models. In the models, I think that's one area where there's probably a lot of work we can do. Like, and it's probably an area where we can move much faster. This is already what's happening in neuroscience. That's happening in kind of more computational neuroscience and so on for a long time. But like, you can move much faster if you do this on these models. And in fact, like we are collaborating with researchers who want to do this on our models. I think that's one big area. I think there's also others around, like, I think just kind of defining kind of what is alignment? Like, how do you set up, like how do you specify goals? How do you specify the guardrails and so on? Like kind of getting much deeper in the specification is another area, which I think is going to be quite important. I think has so far been underinvested. It's like oftentimes you hear very vague statements around alignment and AI safety and so on. We need to get way, way more crisper on this. And this is probably like, collaboration between technical people from social sciences, from philosophers and so on, really getting much crisper on this stuff. And then there are the technical approaches of like, there's lots of cool ideas here, and I don't know which ones will prevail at the end of the day, but it's like everything from like shaping the reward functions we use to train these models with reinforcement learning, to having kind of, one model oversee the actions of another model and being able to report, what that model is doing and so on. There's lots of different approaches here, and I wouldn't pretend that I'm by any means the expert on like the right investments here, but I know that these are all areas where we are investing and others are investing in, and I think as a kind of society, we should probably invest much more resources in having many more smarter people be incentivized to think about these problems and think about solutions.
So no, that all makes a lot of sense. Switching gears entirely, one thing I was really curious to ask you is, obviously you kind of lead product for ChatGPT. I think, it's amazing just to see the different ways people are using it. I feel like where my mother uses it, everyone's using it in their own way, right? One thing I was really curious about is, how do you guys use it, like internally at OpenAI?
Oh, I think one really cool thing about ChatGPT is that it has such a broad set of use cases. We see this in our users. It's not like users come in with one use case in mind. They usually have a whole, like, a dozen or more kind of pieces in their workflows where they go to ChatGPT, whether it's like answering questions, summarizing things, or doing things like helping with writing and so on. I think internally, definitely we see a lot for coding. People use it to kind of debug issues, pasting in like stack traces and stuff like that. I personally use it a lot for helping me write, both in terms of like being a bit of a helping with writer's block, but also kind of improving my writing, like having like, I would ask ChatGPT like, hey, provide a few, suggestions of how I can improve this, or like, here's an email, I don't really know how to write it, but here's approximately the point I want to get across, give me a first draft. I think those are the things where in the past I would just kind of get stuck, and now I can just ask the model.
I love that.
One last big picture question for me, Peter, and I'm always so curious to hear how a lot of the sharpest minds in AI respond to this question. I'm curious to hear your perspective. What's one thing that you believe strongly about AI and its future that you think is really important, that you think most people would disagree with you on?
Well, I still think the thing I would go back to is like, I do think that we're now at the stage where we should be thinking more about the implications of superintelligence, to be honest. And I don't think this is like something that is just kind of generally accepted that we're going towards that. It's sort of like people are now waking up to the fact that these models can do a lot of the things that us humans can do, but it's not quite there, and it feels like, okay, it can do all these things, but probably won't be able to do X, Y, Z. And every time we've had those X, Y, Z things that, well, the models won't be able to do that, like within short amount of time, the models are able to do that. And so I think taking kind of superintelligence much more seriously, I do think that's like kind of, I think this is one of those things where it's definitely it's not something that everybody has aligned on, that this is something we should take seriously quite yet. People have very different timelines and so on, and I think we should be acting on a potentially much shorter timeline and do that. Basically, what if the timeline is much shorter, and have a plan for that?
I mean, it feels like, in zooming out in the ecosystem today, it really feels like it's, OpenAI's world, right? I mean, you obviously at the forefront of everything. It's every month there's some new product release that everyone is losing their mind over. It's not hard to paint the path where you guys continue kind of leading the field and setting the direction of where things are going. I guess if you were to zoom out in 5 years from now, OpenAI wasn't in that incredible leadership position, like, what do you think would be the most likely reason why?
I think the thing that I'm most paranoid about is like, one of my big primary focuses is making these models much, much better. And that's like where we put a lot of our efforts, both in terms of capabilities, but in terms of safety and so on. The thing that I'm always worried about is that we kind of lose touch with our users. Like, I really think like we need to continue kind of just having a really good relationships with the developers or building on top of our models. And I always feel like worried about, there's this tension that we feel with our developers. Is like they develop something that's like really good, and then we release a model and it kind of replaces some of the stuff that developers have been building on. It's like, it's sort of like, it's not intentional that we want to do that, but it's just like the models just get generally better at stuff. And I think that always worries me. Like I want us to kind of like really start really be in tandem with our developers to create like a great experience for them. And I think this has been particularly on my mind now over the past couple of months, because we've seen a ton of growth, but that also means that we're now less able to attend to all of the developers. Like I remember when we shipped the first version of this API, I knew all our customers by name, but on a first name basis, and worked with them all in Slack channels. And now we have like millions of customers, and it's like, it's just like, how do you scale just a great customer experience? I think that's going to be really important for this to actually be something that people want to embrace and build on over the coming years. So I think if we don't do that, that's sort of risking the whole mission in some sense. I'm very worried about that.
Well, Peter, this has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could, keep talking to you for hours, but then we'd be like risking lengthening that timeline towards superintelligence. So, we won't do that for the world. But we usually ask people just, where people can go to learn more about their work. I will say that I think every listener of our podcast is probably quite familiar with your work. So I'll just leave it to you. Anything you want to plug or point people to, or any kind of follow-ups from our conversation you'd like to leave our listeners with. I'll give you the last word here.
Well, maybe like one thing I would say is that I think definitely the audience we have now is huge with ChatGPT and so on, but I think a lot of people who are using ChatGPT probably don't know that we put quite a lot of effort into our blog, where we try to really demystify a lot of the technology that we're building and the way we think about things. So for people who want to learn more, I would really encourage people to go and check that out. Where we talk about this. How do we think about things as we go closer to superintelligence? How do we think about safety? How do these models work? What are the technical approaches underpinning them and so on? It's a great place where we try to make these blog posts kind of approachable from a more general kind of technical audience. So encourage people to go and check that out.